Thank you all for coming. It's great to see an excellent and enthusiastic crowd. I have my own little company, Sugar Bag Bees, and I also work with the University of Sydney in native bee research, and Western Sydney University I have worked with in the past as well, which is of course very close to here. I'm strongly affiliated with the Australian Native Bee Association, and I would recommend, if you all want to learn more about native bees, to join that association. It's cheap to become a member, and you get a monthly newsletter that's packed full of information about native bees and all things related. So that's a bit of an introduction. I would like to acknowledge country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. I have to apologise, I'm not sure who that... Durry people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I think it's particularly relevant as well when we're talking about native bees to pay our respects to Indigenous people, because they had such a close relationship to native bees. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So it is a pollination workshop. Let's start with the plants rather than the bees. We normally focus on bees and start with bees, but let's start with the plants today. And this is a very basic slide of a generalised flower, and this is where we must start from, but it gets a lot more complex than this. The sex life, if you like, of plants is way more complicated than it is of animals, and we'll get a bit of a feeling for that in the next few slides. So this is a generalised flower, and it has both female parts and male parts on the same flower. That's pretty typical. If you look at those male parts, they consist of a filament. The whole structure is called a stamen. It consists of a stalk and then an anther where pollen grains are produced. And pollen grains are the male sex cells of plants. They are needed to fertilise the female parts, the ovules of the female part of the plant. So they need to get to the stigma where they can germinate, and a tube grows down here in towards the ovule, and then the genetic material that's contained within the pollen grains is released, and it unites with the genetic material. The ovules, the female parts of the plant, creates a diploid, which means it's got two sets of chromosomes, one from the dad, if you like, one from the mum. And so every seed is a potential new genetic mix. So that's basically what sex is all about. It's about getting genetic diversity into the next generation. Inbreeding's unhealthy for all plant and animal populations. It doesn't have, you don't capture and generate the diversity that you need to be able to cope in a changing world. So that's it. We'll talk a lot more about pollen grains from the point of view of bees later, because it's a very important nutrient for bees. But we're just talking about it from the point of view of the plant for the moment. So vectors. I did say that the pollen grain needs to go from where it's produced on a flower to preferably another flower and land on the female part, the stigma of another flower. So you need a vector to do that. And in nature, we have wind. So many plants are wind pollinated. They don't rely on animals, but many other plants do. So wind pollinated plants, many of our primitive plants are wind pollinated. So if you think of that big group of plants called the gymnosperms, so the cone-bearing plants, all of our pine trees, for example, they rely on wind, which has worked for many hundreds of millions of years. But about 120 million years ago, there was a big jump in the evolution in plant reproduction where the flower evolved. The flowering plants evolved. This structure, which allowed more efficient pollination movement, evolved. But before we go on to that, we'll just talk a bit about wind pollination, a bit more about that. So if you think of a pine tree, it produces massive amounts of pollen. And that pollen has to be blown by the wind and hopefully land on a female cone and fertilise that cone. It's not particularly efficient because a huge amount of pollen has to be produced and most of it goes to waste. It doesn't go where it's needed. With the evolution of the flowering plants, plants evolved this structure that attracted a biotic agent. So we talk about wind pollination as being abiotic. It doesn't involve a life form. But the flower uses another living agent, usually a flying animal. So the three main groups of flying animals that have evolved on our planet are birds. There's flying mammals, the bats, and there's also insects. Those three groups of flying animals have become important. They've formed these close relationships with flowering plants. So the plant wants to attract animals to them, which can then feed on the plant, eat some of that pollen, but also transfer it to the next plant. And that's much more efficient because a flying insect will, and we'll possibly see this today, and I'm sure you've all seen it in the past, they can visit one flower and then fly. Then they've got a search image. They'll fly to another flower, often of the same species, and deposit that pollen on that other flower. And this has led, I'm giving you the absolute simplest version of this here, but it's led to the evolution of an incredible diversity of relationships between these flying animals and the plants they're pollinating. We'll talk a bit more about that as we talk about, we'll give some case studies showing how that's happened. But basically this is showing how cross-pollination occurs. So this first slide was really just showing the parts, but in the case of cross-pollination we need a flower and the pollen's produced on that flower, and it doesn't pollinate its own stigma. That would lead to inbreeding, but preferably it goes to the flower of another plant and fertilizes that plant and leads to outcrossing, which creates genetic diversity in the seeds that are produced in that flower. All right, so those pollinators we've mentioned, we've already mentioned the birds and the mammals, the bats, but also within the insects we have bees, of course, and wasps, flies. We've just seen wasps, flies, butterflies, beetles. We saw all of these just now down in the garden. So we've already seen some of this diversity today. The bees are often regarded as the premier pollinators. I'm a bit biased towards bees, but look, we have to acknowledge the importance of these other groups. And we'll talk shortly about some crops that specifically require not bees, but flies and beetles. I'm going to give some examples of that, and moths. So don't forget about the diversity of pollinators, not just bees. So we're going to talk a bit more about plants for the next while, and we're going to talk about plants first of all. So agricultural plants, we're going to be focusing in on those today. Much of what we talk about is applicable to natural ecosystems as well. But when we're growing certain crops, we don't need pollination. So we don't need pollination to grow a carrot because the part of the plant that we are harvesting is not a result of a flower and a fruit or a seed. It's a vegetative structure. It's the enlarged root of the plant. Or if we're growing lettuce, equally, it's not a product of the flower, it's the leaf. So we don't need pollination to produce those edible products. But if you're producing carrot seed to grow the next generation of carrots, or lettuce seed to grow the next generation of lettuces, then yes, you do need pollination. So you just need to keep that in mind, that is the distinction between those. And you will have specialised carrot growers, typically, who are growing carrots, and other growers who are growing seeds to sell to the people who are growing the carrots. All right, so root and leaf crops. Wind pollination. So I said some of the more primitive plants are wind pollinators, but evolution works in interesting ways. So the flower evolved for biotic animal pollination. But in some plants, they've made a switch. That in their evolution, they've gone back to wind pollination for whatever reason. Maybe the grasses, as they were evolving, which are a relatively recently evolved group of plants. If they're dominant, it's hard to believe they're so dominant on the planet today, but they're relatively recent. And as they're evolving on the African plains, maybe that was an environment where it was more efficient actually just to use wind for pollination. Many of those grasses have become, of course, super important in agriculture. 3 species alone, wheat, rice, and maize, produce a huge amount of the human diet. So the grains use wind pollination, but not just the grains. Some other plants as well, and pecan nuts is one example I give here, where you have female and male flowers. The male flowers produce the pollen grains, which need to blow in the wind and land on the female part of the plant. So, you know, some nuts are wind pollinated, some nuts, of course, are bee pollinated, and the nut that's in everyone's mind at the moment in Australia in relation to bee pollination is almonds, yes. But yes, wind can be very important as well, even in some flowering plants. I should have just mentioned one thing I forgot to say before. The reason why plants are so colourful, we've got Superpond has just picked a variety of plants from the floral strip down there, flowers, is to attract. So part of the evolution of the flowering plants for insect pollination was the evolution of colour in those plants. And also scent. So they produce scents which help to draw insects to them. Insects learn. And it's been around for so long, it's instinctive in their behaviour to follow certain groups of volatile compounds, floral scents, which draw them to the flower. So that combination of colour and scent is an attractant. They also provide another attractant as well. Very important attractant. So we've just talked about pollen, but there's another food that plants provide, nectar. So nectar doesn't have a role to the plant specifically, like pollen does. It's simply an attractant. It's just provided to say, hey, come and fuel yourself up, and while you're here, pollinate me. So we're now going to talk. We're going to get a bit more complex now, and we're going to talk about some of the details. And it's actually very simplified and very short abbreviation of the complexity of sex systems. So we call them mating systems or sexual systems, reproductive systems in plants. But they involve a few things called outcrossing. We've already mentioned that. So that's cross-fertilisation, as opposed to autogamy, which is self-fertilisation. I'll use the English words. Let's use English, shall we, for this talk here today. Scientists love these scientific names. Sometimes I wonder why, really. So parthenocarpy, I'm not sure that there is a common name for that. So that's fruits that form without fertilisation, and asexual reproduction. Without fertilisation. Fruits form without fertilisation, and you have asexual reproduction without fertilisation. I might explain that as well when we get to some of the examples. And then there's mixtures of all these things in plants. So let's just look at a few examples of that. Yeah.
You're saying that they won't self-pollinate on that picture at the top you mentioned earlier. So the bees coming along and they're grabbing the pollen. What is it that stops it from pollinating?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to talk about a bit more about this later, and we'll give an example in macadamia, but I can talk about it now. So there are a few different mechanisms that stop self-pollination in these. So these self-incompatible plants. So cross-pollination is required. Self-incompatible plants. So that's where the pollen grain cannot fertilise the ovule of those plants. And often it involves a mechanism so there's a reason why this structure here is long. It's between the stigma, where the pollen grain lands, and the ovule, where the pollen grain needs to get to, or the contents of the pollen grain need to get to, delivered by a tube that grows out of the pollen grain. And that allows the plant, the tissues in the plant, to recognise the genetics of the tissue in the pollen and say, I recognise you, you're the same as me, I'm going to stop you from growing right there. Or, okay, you look like you're good you're different from me. I can assess that you might be a good father for my seeds, and they'll let that tube grow down. So that's a self-incompatibility mechanism in the tube. Now there are some other ones as well where it happens after. So we talk about pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. So the zygote is just the beginning when you get fertilization occurs. And so it can happen before that, and that's what I just mentioned. But it can happen after fertilization as well, where the fertilized ovule starts to grow, but it's not healthy, it's not strong, it may not go very far at all. It might actually reach a viable seed stage, but it's stunted and it doesn't stimulate the nutrients. And I'll give some examples, more examples of that a bit later. Excuse me. So a few examples of where fruits form without fertilization of the ovules. Banana. So if you go back to the rainforests of Papua New Guinea, you will find wild bananas, and they have big seeds in them. And that's because we have selected, and it happened a long time ago, the indigenous people of Papua New Guinea found one plant that was growing that probably wasn't, it would have been a dead end in nature because it didn't produce seeds. But for human agriculture, it was fantastic because it put all that energy just in the fruit. We don't want the seeds, that's not what we eat the fruit. So the fruit is a structure that the plant puts around its seeds to attract dispersal agents. So we're now talking about a completely different mechanism. We're not talking about pollination anymore at flowering time. We're talking about when the seed is produced and the plant now doesn't want to get pollinated, but it wants to get its fruit dispersed. It wants to get them taken away and grow somewhere else, where it's not in competition with the mother. And they can use abiotic and biotic mechanisms to disperse the seed as well. So what would be a biotic mechanism? And a monkey coming along and saying, hey, this is a good fruit, and grabbing some and taking it up in the tree and eating it and spitting it out or pooping it out. That's right. Birds are the same. But for us, the banana the banana of agriculture today doesn't require pollination. So we can get some self-pollination in some crops, and peanuts are an example. So they have a completely closed flower. So they have probably gone along the pathway because they still produce a flower, but it stays closed. And pollination occurs within that flower. Self-pollination. So why would that be? Well, sometimes in nature, it's actually an advantage not to be too variable. If you're growing in a very stable environment, and you're a successful plant, then maybe your offspring are going to be successful as well if they don't change at all. So in the cultivated peanuts that we use today, the flowers are closed and they self-pollinate within the flower, and then they grow into a fruit. Soybeans kind of got a little bit of the same thing happening, but it's got a bit of a... I'll word that differently. Soybean does try and get pollinated, but it's got the self-pollination as a backup. How does that work? It opens and it's receptive to insects and cross-pollination during the day, and if that happens, great, it gets fertilized. If it doesn't happen, it self-pollinates that night. So that's a bit of a mixture of the two. So self-pollination so it's self-pollination, but it's using wind or bees. And a good example of that is tomatoes. They're self-pollinating. You can grow a big field of tomatoes, same variety, all genetically identical. They're very happy to pollinate themselves, self-pollination. But they need an animal to do it, or wind. So here's, just showing that, here's a tomato flower, and that's a brush. That's just for scale and shows the pollen grains as well. And this would be for artificial, this would probably be for plant breeding, you would do this. if you're breeding a variety of tomato and different varieties of tomatoes. But you can see here the tomato flower, it's got petals to attract a pollinator, and it's got this structure here, it's called the sexual column, and it contains both the male and the female parts. So those lobes along the side are the pollen, are the anthers that produce pollen, and right at the tip here is the stigma, and you can see they're very close to each other. So the pollen hasn't got to get moved very far. So wind and insects can do that. So in production, you can use bumblebees in glasshouses in Europe, for example. That's what they use for pollination. Or in Australia, we don't have bumblebees, and so they use. Have anyone seen pollination in glasshouses? Pardon me. Yeah, it's like a manual vibrating wand. So here's another example of cross-pollination, but the point I want to make here, it's not for all varieties. So this is something you have to be aware of. You might learn something here today and think, oh, that applies to me, but no, it doesn't. It depends on the variety that you're growing. So with dragon fruit, sometimes called pitaya, does it grow this far south? Yep. So it's essential for some cross-pollination is essential for some self-incompatible varieties for better fruit size and set. So generally, if you're not sure, just grow a few varieties. That's one of the mantras that you should take away from this session this morning. Multiple varieties growing together in fields is generally a very sensible thing to do.
When you say varieties, do you mean the different cultivars?
Yeah, cultivars, varieties.
Does that mean then the next generation is going to be completely different from the parent plants?
Yes, it often happens. So some plants that favour outcrossing, the seeds that are produced are great for eating, but they may not be great to grow again for the next generation of plants. So that's where you need to be careful. That's often what we do is we use vegetative propagation so that we're sure we've got the same genetic lineage when we're growing the plants, but the fruits will often be better if they're crossed. So with pitaya, the flowers open at night, so it's mainly night-flying insects that do the job, and moths and bats are typical night-flying pollinators. Bees may contribute as well because sometimes the flowers open before dark and they're still open in the morning, so bees make a contribution. And some people hand-pollinate this crop. Yep, you've heard of that before, don't you?
I've got a mate that has just done hers with her last dragon fruit crop.
Right, yeah, and it was probably a big job, right?
Opportunity to do it.
Yes, because it's only open one night.
Correct.
Yes, yeah, and there's another famous crop that is 100% pollinated by hand, and also very short opportunity to grow it. Vanilla, very good. Yeah. Yeah, no. There's a natural pollinator of vanilla has never been found. So it was cultivated by the indigenous people of Central America, vanilla, and there are wild varieties or wild species of vanilla, and they're pollinated by these large bees, large orchid bees. It's an orchid. And they're pollinated by large orchid bees. We don't have orchid bees in Australia, but they do in that part of the world. And it's been taken out of the wild and cultivated, and somewhere in that process over thousands of years, the original native orchid bee that pollinated it has disappeared. It's gone extinct. And even in the native range, you don't get pollination. It has to be done by hand. It's basically extinct. The plant's extinct in nature. Yeah.
Without us.
Yes.
That's done.
That's right. Yeah.
Evolutionary dead end.
Yeah, absolutely it is. There's another important. You probably won't get this. It's a bit hard to. But silkworms are another example of in that case it's an insect. It's not a plant.
Dead end.
An evolutionary dead
without
end.
human intervention
Yes,
to keep
yes.
them propagating.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
All right, so I just want to make a point here about crop pollination, and that is that, and we just mentioned it before, is that many of our crops are genetically very uniform. They're varieties, they've been selected, and they are propagated vegetatively to ensure that we get exactly the same genetics from one generation to the next. And it's represented here by these rows of trees in a field. And basically, you've got a row of one crop variety. Let's call it A. And another crop variety here, let's call it B. So if we look at the pollination, the pollination of that flower by its own pollen, that's obviously self-pollination. Or if it's from one flower to another flower on the same plant, that's self-pollination as well. Even if it's from the flower of this plant to the flower of that plant, it's still self-pollination because it's the same variety, it's genetically the same. All right, so when we're talking about agriculture, self-pollination means a slightly different thing to nature. So in nature, most plants are like us, all genetically different, but not so in agriculture. So what we do need often to do is get this movement of pollen across rows. And where you've got these many rows of the same variety, you need to get it across many rows. So this is a question of orchard design, how you plant your rows in the first place when you design that orchard. And it's also a question of getting the bees in after the trees are growing. So sometimes if you plant great big blocks of the same variety, then you're going to struggle. So yeah, that's something you do need to take into consideration. All right, so we've talked about this cross-pollination and how plants adapt to that, and so how plants ensure that happens. And we can have a situation where the male and female organs mature at different times so that you can't get self-pollination on the same plant. So when the female part matures first, we call it protogyny. Where the male part matures first, we call it protandry. Yes, it's separated in time. If pumpkins, it's also separated in space because you have male flowers on different parts of the plant. So we'll get to that one as well. Yes, that's true, but it's even a little bit more complicated there. So macadamia is an example. So we're getting onto an example of a complex mating system now where a few of the things we've just talked about are shown. So we've got this protandry where the male matures first. So what we're looking at here are flowers with the male structure up here and the female part. So they're the male parts. Where's the female part? So the female parts look pretty similar. Let me just get my eye in here. These are all female parts, these longer ones. The male parts are these, yes, down the bottom of the flower. They're on the petals. The anthers are on the petals. But something interesting happens here. It's called secondary pollen deposition. So the pollen doesn't just stay in the anthers. It actually gets dumped onto the stigma before the flower opens. So the flower opens and the pollen and the stigma are right together. The stigma's already covered by self-pollen. So that pollen should be able to grow, right? No, it can't because the stigma is not yet receptive. It has to become receptive to the growth of pollen tubes before it will grow. And the pollen's ready to grow, but it's not a suitable substrate for it to grow in. All right, so that's the separation. That's how they've separated the male and female at the same time. So we've got this protandry, we've got the secondary pollen deposition. Now, if that pollen hangs around for a while, the female part will become mature, a few days, and they can grow. But that's when we have this mechanism that we talked about before in the style here, where if that pollen grain starts to grow, the tissues in the style arrest its growth and say, no, you're not going any further, and stop it. So what the plant would like to happen is that the pollen gets dumped here, a bee comes along and removes that pollen, and then that pollen goes and fertilizes other flowers that are in the mature female stage. And then another bee comes along a few days later and says, hey, I know there's pollen at the top of these flowers. I've learnt that. I've already, collected it from here before. So the bee learns that it's there. So they go looking for it up here. It's not there, but they rumble around looking for it and deposit some pollen from another flower onto the stigma, which is now receptive, and it can grow. All right? So it's this complicated mechanism involving a bunch of sub-mechanisms to enable cross-pollination to occur. All right, so that's macadamia. Oh, that's just showing. I should have used this one. It would have shown the... Anyway, no worries. There you can see the female part and see all the pollen dumped on the top of it. And the anthers have peeled back and peeled out of the way. They don't have any pollen on them anymore. Yep. All right. So, lychee. Do you grow lychees down here? Bit too cold. Yeah. So you get into so lychees are sort of subtropical. You get them a lot in southern Queensland. Then when you go to North Queensland, you get another related crop that grows up there where they like it fully tropical, which is rambutan. Oh, longan. No, longan's are subtropical as well. Yeah, they'll grow in the subtropics, but rambutans, that needs full tropical climate. Yeah. So lychees. So in the case of lychees, what we have is we have the male and female flowers separated. This is a male flower, no female part at all, and just these typical anthers. You can see also there the attractant, the nectar, very clearly there. And it produces a lot of nectar. So when flowers produce a lot of nectar, it's a bit of a sign straight away that maybe they're attracting more than just insects. What might they be attracting? Birds. Birds need a lot of nectar. Yeah. Ants, yes, ants are sometimes attracted to flowers. Ants are typically not very good pollinators. They don't really travel far enough, and they go to a flower and they go back to their nest, and then they don't really get the chance to go to another flower. So they're not really what plants want to visit them. So here's a female flower now. So what we've got here are the stigmas, and there's two actually. Have you ever noticed that sometimes you can get two lychees growing together? They're sort of joined and have a flat part in the middle where they're joined. That's where both of these stigmas get pollinated at the same time. It's a bit like twins in humans, identical twins in humans. If you get two ovules, two eggs pollinated by two sperm at the same time, you can get twins. It doesn't normally happen because it's got to be identical timing, because once one gets fertilised, the other one becomes non-receptive. And it's the same in this plant. Once one side's fertilised, the other one's non-receptive. So there's the ovules down there. They will swell into the fruits, the lychee fruits. So the male and female flowers are separated. Now, if you want to get cross-pollination, but on the same plant, the male and female on the same plant. So you need overlap of the stages for good pollination. On a single tree, they develop at different times. So there's a problem there, isn't there, for cross-pollination? But you need multiple trees of different cultivars to maximise the chances of getting overlap of the male parts of one cultivar and the female parts of another cultivar. All right? And you also need the pollinators. All right? So we're talking about the breeding system of the plant. You need a pollinator to visit this flower and then to visit this flower to deposit the pollen. And the pollinators included a diversity of things, including birds. So there's a lorikeet on a lychee flower, and there's a native bee on a lychee flower. And there's a stingless social native bee on a lychee flower. Is that a male or female flower? Male, very good. And so is that one. And see this native bee here. I'll just talk a little bit about bee biology. Oh, I should wait till later, but I can't resist. So this is a bee. We'll talk about it a bit later. It's an untidy bee. It doesn't groom itself. It doesn't comb its hair very nicely. It's like a teenager, you know. They just race out and leave home and get busy, and they don't even they don't think about grooming their bodies like most bees do. That actually makes it a great pollinator because it's covered in pollen, and as it moves onto the female part of a flower, it's going to spread it everywhere. So this was a really good pollinator, and they were there on this. This was a huge lychee plantation. It was 1 kilometre from one end of the plantation to the other. It was massive in the Bundaberg area, and there were, I don't know how many millions of these bees on that farm. There was, I want to say billions of these bees on that farm, because every tree had hundreds, thousands of flowers, and every flower had these bees crawling all over them. So many of them. They are a native bee that no one was specifically managing. They were just an ecosystem service. They were just an insect that grows naturally in that system, breeds naturally in that system, and then emerges, comes out, looks for resources, and possibly the populations were very high because every year there's this massive flowering by lychees. So in this case, agriculture is benefiting nature, if you like. Nature's definitely benefiting agriculture by providing this free service. So we can manage our bees in various ways. In this case, we don't really have to, but maybe we could make our farm more friendly to this bee, and that's what we're going to be focusing on a lot today. All right, and we can definitely manage our stingless bees through managing them in hives, and honeybees as well. We can manage them as in hives. So I think that honeybee there is very close to a male and a female flower, but it may not be pollinating that because I don't think that's receptive yet. All right, so just a few other interesting adaptations for cross-pollination. Here's where the male and the female plants are separated on different plants. So that was on the same plant. In the case of lychees, this is different plants. So here you have male pawpaw flowers or papaya flowers, and here you have the female ones. So you do need an insect moving from one plant to the next to pollinate them. And the insect, mostly for papaya, is an unusual one. Anyone know what that is? We'll show it later. Have a think about that. Or maybe you might want to guess it now, but... no, you don't know? Yep. So jackfruit. So these are another one where the male and the female parts are separated, but on the same plant, actually. But they emerge at different times, so you need them to spread. So that's just another example. Watermelon's an interesting one. So it's monoecious, which means there are both male and female flowers on the same plant, and you do need bees to move that pollen because they're separated in space. That's the main. I think that's the main mechanism. You mentioned that they're separated in time as well.
In pumpkin, yeah, the male flowers always open first.
Right.
The female doesn't open for ages.
Okay. So I think in watermelon it's not so much like that, but pumpkin, that's interesting to know that about pumpkin. Yeah, I think pumpkin is a similar time. So what we've got here is hand pollination. So you wouldn't normally hand pollinate watermelon. It wouldn't be commercially viable. But just showing here, there's the female part, and you can see it's covered with pollen grains, and there's the male part. They look quite similar. They're not obviously male and female in the case of watermelon, but that's what the flowers look like. Now, in the case of watermelon, a point I'd like to make here is that you need those stigmas to be covered in pollen for good pollination. Why would that be? Just hang on to that question. I'm just going to go back to lychee. Lychee contains one or at most two ovules. there's only one seed in a lychee. So you actually only, in theory, need one pollen grain to pollinate that fruit. The more seeds you've got in that fruit, the more pollen grains you need. So in the case of watermelon, how many seeds have you got in the watermelon? Now don't ask me about seedless fruits here. You got tons. But even in seedless watermelons, they still need the seeds to be pollinated and to grow just a bit, and that starts the process of the fruit growing, and then the seeds die. That's something that humans have developed or bred for, but they still need that pollination for it to happen. Yep, and you need lots of them. Stingless bee on watermelon, on a male flower there. You can see it's loaded itself up. Now, I did mention that other bee before that's covered in pollen. Stingless bees, and honey bees for that matter, social bees that carry their pollen on their hind leg, don't have as much pollen often dusted on their bodies. So there's a case here that's some of the native solitary bees, and especially those ones I showed before, which we call halicted bees. We saw one down in the garden before, are better than the social bees that we keep in hives for pollination. That's an argument that's made. The research hasn't really been done to prove that in many cases, but it's a hypothesis anyway. So just showing what pollinates watermelon, some research has been done by folks from the Western Sydney University here, all over Australia, and showing that it's mainly honeybees everywhere. But in some places, significant contributions come from other insects, and native bees, both in chinchilla, up here in the subtropics, and down here in the temperate areas, make a contribution. But it's very hard to see. Whoever chose the colours for this graph, they need to work on their presentation skills. Because can you make out just there's a line there. Basically what it's showing is that up in the subtropical areas, the social stingless bees were doing it. Down in the more temperate areas, it was the solitary native bees that were doing it. And we'll talk about that later, how we've got the honeybees in most parts of Australia, but particularly in southern Australia, they're very important. And we've got the social native bees that are mainly in northern Australia. You've got an overlap here, but just on the extreme edge of the overlap here, because the native social bees only just make it to here. So yeah, we talk about native bees in southern Australia, we're talking about solitary bees. We talk about native bees in northern Australia, could be solitary bees, but also our native social bees, which we'll be talking quite a lot about today. If you look at these little native beehives, that's what we're talking about there, our native social bees, the stingless bees. All right, so I just wanted to make the point here. We've talked a lot about crops, but most of what we've just said is very important in nature as well, and continues to be important. Pollination allowing genetic diversity in the next generation of seeds is super important. And you could argue that because of the way humans have cleared so much of our planet and fragmented the remaining natural systems, it's even more important that we get a pollination. So to get viable populations of plants and getting good mixing up of genetics within those fragmented native plant populations is particularly important now. So I want to talk a bit about a topic now, which is a very broad scale agricultural production and the role of pollination. So, because I think, it's kind of against my interest to make this point, but the importance of pollination is exaggerated, I think, in the media. And this is why. This is the case that I will put, and many scientists do put this case, is that we don't need, first of all, pollination, animal pollination. We need wind pollination, but we don't need animal pollination for our grain crops or our root crops. So if you think of all of those grain crops, and if you think of potatoes and cassava in the tropics and so many root crops, huge contribution to the human diet. And they don't need pollination. but many crops do. So, you know, many oil seeds, but not all oil seeds. Many fruits, but not all fruits. Vegetables, nuts, such as almond, but not all nuts, as we saw before with pecans and others. Protein crops, some beans, but not all beans. And stimulant crops like coffee and cacao, but not tea. So, and of course for animal feed, not the grasses, but some of the legumes that we use in agriculture like lucerne and clover. All right. Now let's just look at a bit more detail here to make my case, and that is that if you look at the number of crops that are at least partially dependent on pollination, it's 75%. And sometimes you see those pictures of a greengrocer's shelf with or without pollination. Have you seen those pictures where someone's taken a picture of a normal greengrocer shop and then they've taken away everything that's insect pollinated? And this is what we've got left. So they're making the point how much we need pollination. It's a bit of an exaggeration. It's a bit of a media beat up, which is possibly not a bad thing to do. I'm not really knocking it. Sometimes humans need to feel that we're in a crisis before we do anything about anything. It's visibility. So look, it's probably a legitimate thing to do to draw attention to what is a real issue. But it's exaggerated. And why? So 75% sounds really, really bad, right? But it's actually only 35% of crop production depends on, is from crops that are at least partially dependent. So you take away all of those crops, such staples like cereals, or not dependent, and you're down to 35%. When you look at the actual tonnage of crops that need pollination, that are dependent on pollination, it's between 5 and 8%. All right, so that's probably the realistic figure. However, if you look at that figure, that's still $350 billion worth of produce. Yeah, so still super important. And despite the fact that we're having a bit of a struggle supplying the bees to pollinate the crops that do need them, we're still growing more crops that rely on insect pollination. The proportion of our crops that we're growing that rely on that insect pollination is actually increasing. So, the bees are important. Now, I mentioned this pollination dependence idea, that some crops are partially pollination dependent. So let's just look at that. As we said, some cereals have zero dependency. Sugar canes are a good example of a big crop that has zero dependency on insects to pollinate it. And right down to completely essential, like, here's a few examples here. Kiwis, melons, pumpkins. If you do not have pollination, you will get no crop. And then there's all these intermediate stages, so from 0 to 100% dependent. So you've got to kind of take that into consideration when you're estimating the importance of pollination.
So for example, with carrots, even though we don't depend on pollination because we're eating the root, for the people who have to make carrot seeds to sell to carrot farmers, don't they need pollination?
Absolutely. So, does it say carrots up here?
Yeah.
So there really should be, in brackets after that, the root crop. And there should be another one down here, carrots. Seeds.
And a lot of that would have the same kind
Yes, it would.
Yeah.
It would. So, that's some nuance that even this detailed table hasn't captured. So it's complicated. All right, we're going to move on to bees now. Forget about those plants. They can't even walk. They can't fly.